The first thing Dr. Lyra Calloway noticed was that her hands were shaking. Not from cold, the room was warm, a diffuse golden light pouring through panels overhead that looked like frosted glass but hummed faintly, the way nothing made of glass ever did. She was sitting upright on a narrow cot, wearing a gray coat she didn't recognize, in a room she had never seen, and she had no idea who she was. That wasn't quite true. She knew her name. It came to her the way a word surfaces when you stop trying to remember it, not recalled but simply present. Lyra Calloway, neuroscientist. The rest was fog. She stood. Her legs were steady, which surprised her. The room was small, clinical, with smooth walls the color of wet sand and a single door that appeared to have no handle. A shelf held a sealed canister of water and a thin nutrient bar wrapped in translucent film. A display panel on the wall showed symbols she couldn't read, tall, vertical glyphs that pulsed faintly in teal. An alien station. She knew that much without knowing how. Her coat was heavy, not from fabric, from something inside it. She reached into the left pocket and found nothing. The right pocket held a stylus with no markings. She almost set it down, but then her thumb found a seam along the coat's inner lining, just below the left breast panel. A deliberate seam, hand-stitched with coarse gray thread that didn't match the coat's weave. She pulled the thread. The lining opened, and 31 small squares of paper fell into her lap. Each one was the size of a playing card. Each one was numbered. Each one was written in a handwriting she recognized, after a long stunned moment, as her own. Note 31 read, "Start here. You've been wiped. Everything below is true. You wrote all of this. Trust yourself." Lyra stared at the words. The handwriting was cramped, efficient, slanting left the way hers always had. She knew that about herself, the way she knew her name. It was her hand. She turned the card over. The back read, "The collective wiped you because you found something they couldn't erase from the data. Read the notes in order. Do not skip. Do not trust anyone on this station until you reach note 1. She looked at the door. It was still closed. No sound from the corridor beyond. She spread the 31 notes on the cot, arranged them in descending order, and began. Note 30. You are on Verath Station, a joint research facility orbiting a G-type star in the Tessari Reach. The station is run by the Oravan Collective, a networked intelligence. Not a hive mind exactly, more like a shared perceptual field. Every Oravan on this station sees what every other Oravan sees, hears, remembers. They have no concept of private memory. They think it's a disorder. Lyra absorbed this. The note's tone was clinical, detached. She recognized it. She wrote reports like this, she was certain of that, even without remembering a single report she'd written. Note 29. You arrived here 11 months ago as part of a Terran-Oravan research exchange. Neuroscience. Your specialty is memory consolidation, how individual brains store, retrieve, and protect information. The Oravan invited you because they've never understood how a species can function without shared memory. They wanted to study you. You wanted to study them. Note 28. The Oravan wipe is clean, chemical photonic. It targets episodic memory, events, experiences, autobiographical content. It leaves semantic memory intact, language, facts, procedural knowledge. You still know how to walk, how to read, how to use lab instruments. You still know what neuroscience is. You just don't remember living it. Her hands had stopped shaking. The notes were doing what they were designed to do. She could feel the architecture of a mind beneath the words, her own mind, working backward from the event, building a path she could follow even without memories. It was, she realized, exactly what a neuroscientist would do. Note 27. You've been wiped before. This is your 4th wipe. You know this because the first 3 times you woke up with no notes and no idea what had happened. Each time it took you weeks to reconstruct enough context to understand what was done to you. After the 3rd wipe, you decided to build a system. You stitched these notes into the coat lining because the Oravan check digital records and confiscate physical documents during the wipe procedure. They don't search clothing seams. 4th wipe. Lyra felt the weight of that settle into her chest. She'd been erased 3 times and hadn't even known it until she'd figured it out, apparently, all on her own. She kept reading. Note 26. The Auravan don't think wiping you is cruel. They think memory is communal property. In their framework, erasing one node's local storage is routine maintenance. They wipe each other constantly. It's how they resolve conflicts. One node disagrees, the collective overwrites. They applied the same logic to you because they genuinely don't understand why it would be different. Note 25. This is important. The Auravan are not villains. They are not malicious. They are a collective species who sincerely believe that private memory is a deficiency. When they wipe you, they believe they are helping you rejoin a shared state you've been tragically separated from. You need to understand this because what you found is going to make you angry, and anger will get you wiped again. Lyra set that note down and breathed. She could feel anger at the edges, distant, formless, like knowing a storm is coming by the change in pressure. But the note was right. The previous version of herself had anticipated that. Note 24. After your 3rd wipe, you started keeping a concealed lab journal, physical, hand-coded, stored inside a ventilation panel in Lab 7 South. The journal contains your actual research data. The code is simple. Every 3rd word in each entry is the real content. The rest is filler designed to read like mundane station notes if the Auravan find it. Note 23. Your official research was mapping Auravan perceptual integration, how the shared field coordinates sensory input across thousands of nodes. Your actual research, the work they keep wiping you for, started in month 4 when you found the substrate. Note 22. The substrate is a deep-layer neural architecture in Auravan physiology. It sits below the shared perceptual field. Every Auravan has one. It is not shared. It is not networked. It is entirely private. The Auravan don't know it exists. Lyra read that note twice, then a 3rd time, a networked species with a hidden private layer. A collective that contained, buried beneath its shared consciousness, the architecture for individual memory. The implications climbed through her like a vine finding light. Note 21. The substrate is dormant. It has never been activated in any living Auravan. But the neural pathways are fully formed: dendrites, axonal projections, synaptic cleft geometry. All of it. It's not vestigial. It's not evolutionary debris. It's ready. It's been ready for a long time. The collective just never turned it on. Note 20. You ran activation models. 37 simulations across 9 months of concealed work. Every model converged on the same result. If the substrate were activated in even a single Auravan node, that node would begin forming private memories. Episodic memories. The kind the collective erases during wipes. The kind you keep losing. Note 19. The activation trigger is simple. A specific electromagnetic frequency applied to the substrate's dendritic field for 12 continuous seconds. You identified the frequency, 42.7 terahertz. You built a portable emitter from modified lab equipment. It's in the ventilation panel in Lab 7 South, behind the journal. Lyra paused. Her coat was still heavy on her shoulders. The light from the overhead panels had shifted from gold to warm amber, a station cycle, she guessed, simulating a sun that wasn't there. She counted the remaining notes. 12. Whatever came next, the previous version of herself had considered it important enough to compress 11 months of work into these 31 cards and stitch them into a coat lining by hand. Note 18. Here's the part that matters. The collective wiped you because you proposed activating the substrate, not secretly. You wrote a formal research paper and submitted it to the Auravan Science Directorate. You argued that the substrate was evidence that Auravan biology was designed, evolved, grown, engineered, however it happened, to support individual memory. That the shared field was an overlay, not the foundation. That every Auravan alive was carrying the capacity for private selfhood, and had simply never used it. Note 17. The directorate's response was to wipe you within 6 hours of receiving the paper. They classified your research. They purged your digital files. They confiscated your physical notes, the ones they found. They issued a station-wide directive. The substrate does not exist. The research never happened. Dr. Lyra Calloway's memory was corrected for her own well-being. Note 16. You expected this. That's why you had already stitched the first version of these notes into your coat. The first version was rougher, only 14 cards. After you woke up from wipe 4, found the notes, and reconstructed your work, you expanded them to 31. Each wipe teaches you what you need to tell yourself next time. Lyra's throat tightened. She was reading a letter from a version of herself she couldn't remember being, and that version had already been through this, the confusion, the anger, the reconstruction, 4 times. The woman who wrote these notes had woken up empty 4 times and chosen each time to rebuild, to trust her own handwriting, to keep going. Note 15. You are not alone in this. An Oravan named Tessic has been helping you since month 6. Tessic is a junior node in the perceptual calibration division. Tessic has never disagreed with the collective before, but your substrate research disturbed something in Tessic's processing. Tessic began experiencing what you would call doubt, a private cognitive state the collective does not model and therefore cannot detect. Note 14. Tessic cannot store private memories the way you can, but Tessic has been exhibiting anomalous behavior, rereading your confiscated research files from cached fragments, asking questions the collective hasn't prompted, visiting your quarters after each wipe to check whether you've woken up. The collective has not noticed because it has no framework for individual curiosity. It literally cannot see what Tessic is doing because it doesn't have a category for it. Note 13. When Tessic arrives, and Tessic will arrive, probably within 2 hours of your waking, say the word dendrite. Tessic will understand. It means, I have my notes, I remember the work, I'm ready to continue. Lyra checked the door again, still closed, still silent, she kept reading. Note 12. The emitter is ready. You built it before the 4th wipe. It works. You tested it on a tissue sample from an Oravan who had undergone voluntary node separation for medical reasons. The substrate activated in the tissue. Private synaptic pathways formed within 90 seconds. The activation is real. Note 11. What you haven't done, what you were planning to do when they wiped you, is tested on a living Oravan. That requires consent. Real consent, not collective-approved consent. An individual Oravan choosing privately to allow the activation. The only candidate is Tessic. Note 10. Tessic has agreed. But Tessic's agreement was given to a version of you that Tessic remembers and you don't. This is the hardest part. You need to re-earn that trust without the shared history. The notes can't do that. Only you can. Lyra set the note down and pressed her palms flat on the cot. 9 notes left. She was halfway through, and the architecture was clear. She had found something that could change every Oravan alive. The collective had erased her for it, and she had built a system to survive the erasure. What she hadn't solved was the gap between knowledge and trust. The fact that she was asking another being to change its fundamental nature based on the word of a woman who couldn't remember asking. Note 9. Your lab journal has a section at the back, pages 44 through 51. Those pages aren't research. They're observations about Tessic, how Tessic moves differently when no other Oravan is nearby, how Tessic's chromatic patterns shift toward violet during private conversations, a coloration the collective doesn't monitor because it's classified as thermoregulatory noise, how Tessic once asked you what it feels like to dream. Note 8. You don't need to fake a relationship with Tessic. The relationship is real. You just don't remember it. Read pages 44 through 51 and let the observations do the work. Tessic will recognize the person who wrote them, even if you don't. Note 7. The plan is this. Retrieve the emitter from Lab 7 South. Meet Tessic. Apply the 42.7 terahertz signal for 12 seconds. If it works, if the substrate activates, Tessic will begin forming private memories. Tessic will become the first Auravan in recorded history to have a self that the collective cannot access, overwrite, or erase. Note 6. The collective will detect the change. Not immediately, the substrate operates below the shared field's resolution. But within hours, Tessic's behavior will diverge enough to trigger a diagnostic sweep. When that happens, the collective will attempt to reintegrate Tessic. If the substrate has taken hold, reintegration will fail. The collective will then face a choice it has never had to make. Accept that one of its nodes has become an individual, or destroy the node. Note 5. You believe the collective will not destroy Tessic. This is not optimism. This is based on 9 months of observing Auravan conflict resolution. The collective resolves disagreements through overwrite, but overwrite requires the target node to be compatible with the shared field. An activated substrate makes the node incompatible. Destruction of an incompatible node has never been done. There is no protocol for it. The collective would have to invent the concept of killing, and you don't believe a species that has never needed the concept can invent it fast enough to use it. Note 4. If you're wrong about that, Tessic dies. You need to be honest with Tessic about this. The previous version of you was honest. Be honest again. Note 3. After the activation, your role changes. You stop being a researcher and start being a witness. The Terran embassy will need your testimony, your concealed journal, your simulation data, your tissue sample results. The Auravan Science Directorate will deny everything. Your wiped memory will be used against you. The notes won't be enough. Note 2. That's why the journal matters. Every third word. Pages 1 through 43 are your research coded. Pages 44 through 51 are your observations about Tessic. Page 52 is a letter you wrote to yourself. Read it last. Note 1. You have done this before. You will do it again if you have to. The collective can erase what you remember, but it cannot erase what you are. You are the kind of person who stitches notes into a coat lining. You are the kind of person who wakes up empty and chooses to rebuild. Trust that. Trust yourself. Lyra sat in the warm amber light and held Note 1 in both hands. The paper was thin, the handwriting small and precise, and the words were the most intimate thing she had ever read, a message from herself to herself, across a gap that memory couldn't bridge. She folded the notes, all 31, into a precise stack, and slid them back into the coat lining. Then she restitched the seam using the stylus's blunt end to press the thread back through its original holes. She stood and walked to the door. It opened when she approached, a sensor, not a lock. The corridor beyond was wide, gently curved, lit by the same amber panels. The walls were the color of pale clay, and the air carried a faint mineral smell like warm stone after rain. An alien station. Her station, apparently, for 11 months she couldn't recall. Lab 7 South was 3 corridors away. She knew this because Note 24 had included a directional reference. Left, second junction, right, end of corridor. And she moved through the station with a confidence that felt borrowed. The corridors were wider than any human architecture would build, 3 meters across. The ceilings vaulted in smooth arcs that made her feel small in a way that had nothing to do with scale. The floor was warm beneath her shoes, a faint pulse traveling through it at regular intervals like a heartbeat. The station's heartbeat, she thought, or the collective's. She passed 2 Auravan in the first corridor. They were taller than her by half a meter, their bodies slender and jointless in a way that suggested cartilage rather than bone. Their skin shifted color as they moved, pale blue to gray-green, a slow wash that seemed to follow their attention. Neither looked at her. She was presumably beneath their notice. A corrected node, restored to baseline. At the first junction, she paused. A group of 4 Auravan stood near an archway, their chromatophores cycling in a synchronized pattern, a conversation, she realized. Not spoken, shared. They were exchanging information through their perceptual field, the way she might exchange words. She watched the patterns ripple across their skin and understood, with a certainty that lived in her training rather than her memory, that she was watching thought itself made visible. Every idea they had, every observation, every conclusion broadcast, received, integrated. No secrets, no privacy, no self that couldn't be read. She thought about Note 22, the substrate, a private layer beneath all of that, architecture for a self that the broadcast couldn't touch, dormant, waiting. She kept walking. Lab 7 South was unlocked. The room was bright, white gold daylight from overhead collectors flooding a workspace filled with instruments she recognized, without remembering having used. Spectral analyzers, neural mapping arrays, a chromatography station with vials racked in color-coded trays. Her hands moved with certainty. She crossed to the ventilation panel on the far wall, found the seam her previous self had described, and pulled it open. The journal was there. A physical notebook, hand-bound, the cover made from station-issue packing material folded double. She opened it to page 44 and began reading. The observations were meticulous. Tesic's gait pattern altered by 2.3 degrees of lateral sway when no other Oravon was present, a loosening, as if something tightly held was being allowed to relax. Tesic's chromatic patterns during private conversations shifted from the standard blue-green wash to a deep violet that bloomed at the extremities first, fingertips, the edges of the cranial ridge, the thin membranes along the neck. The collective classified this as thermoregulatory fluctuation. Lyra, the previous Lyra, had measured it and found that the frequency matched no known thermoregulatory cycle. It was something else. Something that had no name in the Oravon lexicon, because the collective had never needed to name it. Page 48 contained a single observation that made Lyra's breath catch. Tesic asked me today what it feels like to remember something no one else can see. I told Tesic it feels like carrying a small lamp in a dark room. The light is only for you and it changes the shape of everything around you. Tesic was quiet for a long time. Then Tesic said, "I think I have a lamp, but it has never been lit." Page 50 described a conversation from 3 weeks before the fourth wipe. Tesic had come to Lab 7 South after hours, when the other researchers had left, and the shared field's monitoring load was at its lowest. Tesic had asked Lyra whether private memory could be painful, whether having something that belonged only to you meant also having losses that belonged only to you, griefs the network couldn't dilute, regrets that no consensus could overwrite. The previous Lyra had written, "I told Tesic yes, private memory means private pain. It means carrying things alone that could be shared and choosing to carry them anyway." Tesic asked why anyone would choose that. I said, "Because the alternative is never having anything that's really yours, not even your pain." And Tesic went quiet for a long time, and the violet at Tesic's fingertips was so deep it was almost black, and finally Tesic said, "I think I already have pain that is mine. I just have no place to put it." Lyra closed the journal and pressed her forehead against it. She had never met Tesic. She was certain as she'd ever been about anything, that she loved this being. Not romantically, not possessively. The way you love a colleague who has seen the same truth you've seen and chosen to stand beside it even when the ground is moving. She found the emitter behind the journal. It was the size of a small flashlight, cobbled together from repurposed spectrometer components. The casing was a spectrometer's focusing tube, the emitter head fashioned from what looked like a chromatography lamp's resonance chamber, rewired with fine copper salvaged from somewhere she couldn't guess. A single dial on its side read 42.7 THz, hand-etched into the housing with a stylus. Her stylus, probably. The same one from her coat pocket. The craftsmanship was precise, deliberate, the work of someone who knew the device would have to function perfectly on the first attempt, because there might not be a second. She turned it over in her hands. The weight of it was negligible, barely heavier than a pen. But the weight of what it represented was immense. 11 months of concealed research, 4 memory wipes, 31 handwritten notes, all converging on this small tube that could give an entire species something they didn't know they were missing. She slipped the emitter into her pocket, returned the journal to the ventilation panel, sealed it, and turned to leave. Tessic was standing in the doorway. The Orevan was tall, narrow-shouldered, with the pale blue-gray skin the notes had described. Tessic's chromatic patterns were muted, the standard wash, nothing anomalous. Tessic's eyes were large, dark, and set wide on a face that had no nose bridge, just a smooth plane of skin between the cranial ridge and the thin-lipped mouth. Tessic looked at Lyra the way someone looks at a photograph of a person they used to know. "Dendrite," Lyra said. The effect was immediate. Tessic's skin flushed violet at the fingertips, then the neck membranes, then the edges of the cranial ridge, the exact pattern the journal had described. Tessic stepped into the lab and the door sealed behind. "You found the notes," Tessic said. The voice was quiet, pitched low, with a harmonic undertone that vibrated in Lyra's sternum. "All 31. The last time you only had 14. You said it wasn't enough." I apparently agreed with myself. Tessic's mouth moved, not a smile exactly, but something Lyra's neuroscience training recognized as involuntary muscular response to positive emotional stimulus. A reflex the collective had no name for, because the collective didn't model positive emotional stimulus in individual nodes. "You don't remember me," Tessic said. "It wasn't a question." "No, but I read the journal, pages 44 through 51. The observations. You asked me what it feels like to remember something no one else can see. I told you it's like carrying a small lamp." Tessic's skin darkened to deep violet, the whole body, not just the extremities. "You told me I had a lamp that had never been lit." "You told me," Lyra corrected gently. "I just wrote it down." Tessic took a step closer. The violet was deep, saturated, and Lyra noticed for the first time that the coloration wasn't uniform. It pooled in certain areas, concentrated at the joints of Tessic's long fingers, at the thin membranes along the neck, at the edges of the cranial ridge where the neural density was highest. The substrate's geography, mapped in color. Tessic was wearing a reaction the collective had no name for. "The last time you woke up," Tessic said, "you had 14 notes and no journal. You spent 3 weeks piecing together what had happened. You came to Lab 7 South because you recognized the instruments, semantic memory, you said. You stood exactly where you're standing now and said, 'Something happened here that I can't remember, but my hands know these tools.' That was when I decided to help you." "Why?" "Because you looked at instruments you'd used for months and you didn't grieve. You didn't rage. You picked up a spectrometer, checked its calibration, and said, 'Whatever I was doing it correctly.' You treated your own erased work with the same professional respect you'd give a colleague's. That is something the collective cannot model. We overwrite, and the overwritten content ceases to exist. You were overwritten, and you honored what was taken." I had no framework for that. They stood in the bright lab, surrounded by instruments Lyra couldn't remember using, and she felt the gap between them. The 11 months Tessic remembered and she didn't. The relationship built on conversations she'd never recall. The trust earned by a version of herself she would never meet again. The notes had given her the facts. They couldn't give her the history. But Tessic's words were filling in something the notes had left out, not data, but texture. The quality of the person she'd been. "I need to ask you something," Lyra said. "And I need you to answer as if I've never asked before, because I haven't." Tessic's chromatophore settled to a steady, deep violet, waiting. "Do you consent to the activation, knowing what it means? Knowing the collective will detect it, knowing I can't guarantee what happens after. You told me this the last time." "I'm not the last time, I'm now, and I need your answer now." Tessic was quiet. The lab hummed around them, instruments on standby, the overhead collectors cycling through their noon-bright phase, the ventilation panel hiding a journal full of coded truths. Lyra waited. She had told herself in Note 4 to be honest. The previous version of her had told Tessic the risks. This version could only stand in the space her predecessor had built and hoped the foundation held. The collective resolved a dispute in the navigation division last cycle, Tessic said. 43 nodes disagreed about a course correction. The collective overwrote all 43. They don't remember disagreeing. They don't remember having a position at all. Their private experience of that moment, the reasoning, the conviction, the feeling of being right about something is gone, erased, replaced with the consensus answer. Tessic looked at Lyra with those dark, wide-set eyes. I watched it happen. I watched 43 people lose the one moment they were most themselves, and I felt something the collective has no word for, something that sits below the shared field in a part of me I cannot show to anyone. The substrate. You named it, I feel it. Is that a yes? It has been a yes since the day you explained what the lamp could look like when it's lit. The version of you who heard me say that is gone, but the answer hasn't changed. Yes. Lyra took the emitter from her pocket. It was warm from her body heat, the hand etched 42.7 on its housing catching the overhead light. She held it so Tessic could see it clearly. 12 seconds, she said. The signal activates the dendritic field in the substrate. Once it begins forming connections, the process is self-sustaining. The collective can't reverse it without destroying the substrate itself, and destroying the substrate would damage the node architecture above it. They'd have to destroy you to undo it. I understand. If I'm wrong about them, if they choose destruction over coexistence, you die. I understand that also. Why? Tessic's violet deepened to something almost black at the extremities, and the harmonic undertone in the voice dropped to a register that Lyra felt in her jaw. Because I have been part of the collective for 47 years, and I have watched it erase you 4 times, and each time you came back. You came back without memories, without proof, without a single ally who remembered your name. You came back because something inside you, something they couldn't reach, something private and small and yours alone, told you to keep going. I want to know what that feels like. I want to know what it is to have something the collective cannot touch. Lyra didn't answer. She raised the emitter and pointed it at the smooth plane of Tessic's cranial ridge, where the substrate sat deepest according to her mapping data. The emitter's dial read 42.7. Her thumb found the activation switch. Ready. Tessic closed those dark eyes. I have been ready longer than you know. Lyra pressed the switch. The emitter hummed, a clean, narrow tone at the edge of hearing like a tuning fork struck in a cathedral. The sound lasted 12 seconds. She counted each one. At second 2, Tessic's chromatic patterns froze, the violet locking in place as if the entire system had paused. At second 4, the chromatophores went blank. No color at all. Just the raw gray-white of unpigmented Oravon skin. And for a terrible moment Lyra thought she damaged something, that the emitter had disrupted the shared field's carrier frequency rather than activating the substrate beneath it. She held the emitter steady. At second 7 the color returned, but not the violet, not the standard blue-green wash, a pattern Lyra had never seen described in any Oravon literature, a slow, radial bloom of deep gold starting from the cranial ridge and spreading outward, like sunrise seen from orbit. The gold moved down Tessic's body in waves, cranial ridge to temples, temples to neck membranes, neck to shoulders, shoulders to the long, jointless arms, reaching the fingertips precisely as the 12th second ended. The emitter clicked off. Tessic opened those dark eyes and looked at Lyra, as if seeing her for the first time. The lab was silent. The overhead collectors hummed. The instruments on their stands held their calibrations, and between the human woman and the Oravon, something had changed that could never be changed back. "What do you feel?" Lyra asked. Tessic's mouth moved. The harmonic undertone was gone. The voice was singular now, unaccompanied, stripped of the resonance that came from the shared field. When Tessic spoke, It was in a voice Lyra had never heard before, not because it was new, but because it was, for the first time, only Tessik's. I feel separate. A pause. The gold chromatophores pulsed once slowly. Not disconnected, not lost, separate. Like a note held after the chord has ended. Another pause, longer. I can still hear the collective, but it sounds like it's in another room. And in here, Tessik touched the cranial ridge with long, jointless fingers, the gold bright under the daylight. In here there is something that wasn't there before. Not a voice, not a thought, more like space, room for something to be mine. That's memory, Lyra said. Private memory, the space where it lives. It's very quiet. It won't stay quiet. Every experience you have from this moment forward will begin writing into the substrate. In a few hours, you'll have memories the collective can't access. Your own, only yours. Tessik looked at Lyra. Then Tessik looked down at the gold-suffused hands, those long, jointless fingers that had never displayed this color before, that had spent 47 years cycling through the collective's shared chromatic vocabulary, and had now produced something entirely outside it. A color born from a part of Tessik's own biology that neither Tessik nor any other Oravan had ever known existed. Is this what you see, Tessik asked, when you look at your own hands? What do you mean? Yours, not the collective's, not borrowed, not distributed, hands that belong to one person. Lyra looked at her own hands, the hands that had stitched notes into a coat lining, that had built an emitter from salvaged parts, that had written 31 cards in cramped left slanting script. Hands she didn't remember using for any of those things, but hers, undeniably, irrevocably hers. Yes, she said, that's what I see. Tessik's gold bloom chromatophores held steady. The color was beautiful, warm, radiant, nothing like the standard blue-green wash. A color the collective had never seen on one of its own nodes, because no node had ever had a reason to produce it. We need to move, Lyra said. The collective will detect the change in your field signature within hours. We need to be at the Terran embassy relay before that happens. Tessik nodded, a gesture that looked unpracticed, as if borrowed from observation rather than instinct. The relay is in the diplomatic quarter, Corridor 12 North, Level 3. How long to get there? 8 minutes. If we encounter other nodes, they will see my altered chromatophores. The gold is anomalous. It will be noted. Can you suppress it? Tessik paused and Lyra watched the gold deepen rather than fade. No, it appears to be involuntary, like you're shaking hands. Lyra almost smiled. Then we walk fast. They moved through the station together. The human neuroscientist who couldn't remember her own work and the Oravan who was learning, second by second, what it meant to have a private self. The corridors were bright, warm, curved in that organic way that suggested the station had been grown rather than built. They passed Oravan, who turned to look at Tessik and then turned away, processing the anomalous chromatophore pattern and filing it under thermoregulatory noise because the collective had no other category for it. Not yet. Tessik walked differently now. Lyra noticed it the way a clinician notices a change in gait. The lateral sway was there, the loosening the journal had described, but there was something else underneath. A hesitancy at each junction, as if Tessik were choosing which direction to go rather than following the collective's navigational feed, making decisions, small ones, but the first ones Tessik had ever made alone. You're processing independently, Lyra said, keeping her voice low. Yes. The navigational data is still available from the shared field, but I'm choosing to verify it against my own spatial memory. It's redundant. I know the station, but the act of checking feels. Tessik paused, searching for a word that might not exist in any language Tessik had access to. Important. That's agency. Is that what it's called? One version of it. They turned into Corridor 9, and the foot traffic increased. Oravan moved in clusters of 3 and 4. their chromatophores cycling in the standard blue-green professional wash. The station's midday cycle was apparently peak activity. Every cluster they passed was another opportunity for detection, another moment when the gold tinge at Tessik's fingertips might register as more than thermoregulatory noise. At the junction of corridors 9 and 12, they encountered a problem. 3 Oravons stood in a loose cluster, their skins cycling through rapid blue-green patterns that Lyra recognized from the journal, from her semantic memory, as diagnostic mode. They were running a local field check. Standard maintenance probably, but the timing was bad. "They're checking field coherence," Tessik murmured. "If they ping me, they'll detect the substrate activity." "Can we go around?" "No. Corridor 12 North is the only route to the diplomatic quarter from this level." Lyra's hand went to her coat pocket, where the emitter sat beside the stylus. She couldn't feel the 31 notes in the lining, but she knew they were there. She'd stitched them back in herself, less than an hour ago. A woman who couldn't remember her own work, carrying the proof of it against her ribs. "Walk with me," she said. "Stay close. If they ping, don't resist it. Let the shared field read you. The substrate will show. Not if you're doing something they expect. The collective processes anomalies against behavioral context. If you're walking with the human researcher, the corrected, wiped, harmless human researcher, and your behavior is consistent with professional escort, the diagnostic will code your field variance as environmental interference. I mapped their detection thresholds. It's in the journal." Tessik looked at her. "You don't remember mapping their thresholds?" "No, but I wrote it down." They walked. The 3 Oravon turned as they approached, their diagnostic cycling accelerating. Lyra kept her pace steady, her expression neutral, her hands at her sides. Tessik matched her stride. The gold chromatophores dimmed slightly, not suppressed, but shaded, the way sunlight dims behind thin cloud. They passed within arm's reach of the diagnostic cluster. One of the Oravon made a sound, a short, rising harmonic that Lyra's semantic memory identified as a query tone. Tessik responded with a flat, standard harmonic. Professional. Unremarkable. The diagnostic cluster turned back to their work. They kept walking. At the corridor's curve, where the cluster was no longer visible, Tessik exhaled, a sound Lyra had never heard an Oravon make. A private sound, involuntary, born from a body learning what relief felt like for the first time. "That was the first time I've ever lied to the collective," Tessik said. "How did it feel?" "Like standing at the edge of something very high and choosing not to step back." They passed through 2 more corridors without incident. The station's daylight shifted as they moved, the overhead collectors tracking through a programmed cycle that mimicked planetary afternoon, the warm gold deepening to amber as they walked. Lyra noticed that Tessik's gait had changed again. The hesitancy at junctions was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confidence. Not the collective's synchronized purpose, where every node moved with the certainty of shared navigational data. Something rougher, something earned. "You're choosing your route," Lyra said. "I'm choosing everything, every step. The speed, the direction, where to look, how to hold my arms. I've been doing all of these things for 47 years, but I've never chosen to do them. The collective coordinated my movement the way it coordinates all movement, optimized, efficient, correct. Now I'm doing it myself, and it's less efficient, and it's," Tessik searched for the word again, "mine." A pair of Oravon passed them going the other direction. Both glanced at Tessik's gold-tinged skin. One of them slowed, its chromatophores flickering in a rapid micro-pattern that Lyra recognized from the journal as an involuntary curiosity response. The same response the collective classified as thermoregulatory noise. The Oravon's gaze lingered on Tessik's hands for a full second before it turned away and kept walking. "That one noticed," Lyra said quietly. "Yes, but it filed the observation under a category it already has. The collective can only see what it has categories for. Anomalous chromatic presentation gets filed as environmental interference or thermoregulatory noise. It will stay that way until the anomaly exceeds the category's tolerance threshold. And when does that happen? When the review queue processes my diagnostic flag. Approximately 32 minutes from now. They reached the diplomatic quarter in 7 minutes. The Terran embassy relay was a small room behind a sealed door with a Terran standard biometric lock. Lyra pressed her palm to it and the lock clicked. Her biometrics, at least, hadn't been wiped. The room was utilitarian. A communication console, a data uplink, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the station's exterior. Through the window, Lyra could see the curve of Verath Station against the black of space, and beyond it, the warm yellow light of the G-type star. She sat at the console and powered it up. The interface was Terran English text, standard navigation. She opened a secure channel to the Terran Science Directorate and began composing a report. "I need the journal," she said. "The coded data, pages 1 through 43. You left it in Lab 7 South." "I know, I need you to get it." Tessic hesitated. The gold chromatophores pulsed. "If the collective detects me before I return, then you'll have private memories of this moment, of choosing to go, of what it felt like to walk these corridors as yourself for the first time. They can't take that from you anymore." Tessic left. The door sealed and Lyra was alone. The relay room was quiet in a way the rest of the station hadn't been. The omnipresent hum of the collective's shared field was muted here. The Terran diplomatic quarter was shielded, she realized. Faraday-equivalent paneling in the walls, blocking the perceptual field's carrier frequencies. A human diplomatic requirement, probably. The Terran embassy wouldn't have wanted its staff's thoughts leaking into an alien network. She sat at the console and stared at the blinking cursor. The silence pressed against her. Without the station's ambient harmonics, she could hear her own breathing, her own heartbeat, the faint creak of her coat as she shifted in the chair. Private sounds. The kind of sounds a person hears when they're the only one listening. She had no memories to draw from, no recalled conversations with colleagues, no first-hand account of her research, no personal testimony of having been wiped 4 times. All she had were 31 handwritten notes, a coded journal she hadn't yet decoded, a tissue sample somewhere in Lab 7 South, and an emitter in her pocket with 42.7 hand-etched into its housing. And the word of a woman she couldn't remember being, stitched into the lining of a coat she didn't recognize, telling her to trust herself. She pulled note 31 from the coat lining and set it on the console beside the keyboard. "Start here. You've been wiped. Everything below is true. You wrote all of this. Trust yourself." She read it again. Then she placed her fingers on the keyboard and began typing with the same hands that had written those notes, guided by the same mind that had conceived them, the same mind, missing only the memories, carrying everything else intact. She began typing. "To the Terran Science Directorate, Tessari Reach Division. This is Dr. Lyra Calloway, Verath Station, Research Exchange Program. I am reporting the following. I have been subjected to involuntary memory erasure by the Oravan Collective on 4 occasions over the past 11 months. The erasures were conducted in response to my research findings regarding a previously unknown neural architecture in Oravan physiology, designated the substrate. The substrate supports private memory formation and has been dormant in all Oravan. I have successfully activated the substrate in one consenting Oravan individual designation Tessic, Perceptual Calibration Division. Supporting data follows." She paused, the cursor blinked. She could hear the station humming around her, the low, constant vibration of a structure that housed thousands of networked minds, all seeing through each other's eyes, all remembering through each other's memory, none of them aware that beneath the shared field, each one of them carried the architecture for a self they'd never met. She typed, "I am unable to provide first-person testimony of the events described above, as my episodic memory has been erased. My evidence consists of a concealed physical journal containing coded research data, tissue sample activation results, and the testimony of my own handwriting in 31 notes I left for myself before the most recent erasure. I am asking the Directorate to dispatch an observer before the Orevan Collective becomes aware of the substrate activation and attempts to suppress it. The door opened. Tessic entered carrying the journal. The gold chromatophores were blazing now, radiant, undeniable, visible from across the room. Tessic set the journal on the console and stood beside Lyra. "I was pinged," Tessic said. "In the corridor outside Lab 7, a maintenance cluster, they detected the field variance." Lyra's fingers paused on the keyboard. How strong was the ping? "Standard diagnostic. Not targeted, they weren't looking for me specifically. They were running a routine coherence check, and my field signature registered as anomalous." The gold Tessic looked down at the radiant chromatophores along one arm. "It's stronger now than when we left the lab. Every minute that passes, the substrate consolidates further. The private pathways are building on themselves. My field signature is diverging from the collective's baseline by an increasing margin. So the longer we wait, the more obvious it becomes." "Yes, but the longer we wait, the deeper the substrate roots, the harder it becomes to reverse. A race between detection and permanence." "Yes." Lyra weighed that. The previous version of herself had understood this dynamic. Note 6 had laid it out clearly. The collective would detect the change. The question was whether the substrate would be self-sustaining by the time they came looking. Every minute counted in both directions. "They flagged it for review," Tessic continued. "The review queue processes in approximately 40 minutes. "Then we have 40 minutes. Lyra opened the journal and began decoding. Every third word, pages 1 through 43. Her own handwriting in a code she designed herself, describing research she couldn't remember conducting. Frequency analyses of the substrate, dendritic density maps, activation threshold curves, tissue sample results before and after with timestamps with control conditions, with the rigor of a scientist who knew her work would be challenged. She typed the decoded data into the relay console as fast as her fingers could move. The code was elegant in its simplicity. Every third word carried the payload, the intervening words forming convincing filler about atmospheric readings and spectrometer maintenance schedules. Page 7 contained the initial discovery: anomalous dendritic density in the subperceptual layer, significantly higher than expected for a vestigial structure. Page 12 had the frequency analysis: 42.7 terahertz, the resonance point at which the dormant pathways responded to electromagnetic stimulation. Page 19 detailed the tissue sample protocol, the sample obtained from a voluntarily separated node during a medical procedure. The activation conducted in a sealed chamber at 300 station time when lab surveillance was minimal. Tessic stood beside her, watching the screen, reading data about Orevan neural architecture that no Orevan had ever seen. The gold chromatophores shifted and pulsed in patterns that had no name in any language. "This is us," Tessic said quietly. "This is what we are underneath." "Yes." "Every one of us, every node. Every one. And no one knows. No one knew, now you do." Page 23 was the breakthrough: the tissue sample results. Before activation, the substrate's dendritic field showed zero synaptic activity, dormant, inert, as silent as stone. After 12 seconds of 42.7 terahertz stimulation, synaptogenesis began within 90 seconds. New connections forming, branching, establishing pathways that operated independently of the shared perceptual field. The architecture was self-organizing. Once initiated, it didn't need the signal to continue. It built itself, as if it had been waiting for permission. Pages 31 through 37 contain the simulation data. 37 models run across 9 months, each predicting the cascading effects of substrate activation in a living node. The models agreed. The activated substrate would generate private episodic memory. The shared field would continue to function. The node wouldn't be cut off from the collective. It would simply have an additional layer, a room of its own, inside a house it had always shared. Tessic touched the screen where a dendritic density map showed the substrate's architecture in cross-section. A dense, intricate web of neural pathways sitting below the shared perceptual field like a root system, beneath a forest floor. "It's beautiful," Tessic said, and the way the word was spoken, singular, unaccompanied, stripped of the collective's harmonic resonance, told Lyra that this was the first aesthetic judgment Tessic had ever made alone. Pages 38 through 43 were the most dangerous. They contained the evolutionary analysis, her argument that the substrate wasn't an accident. The dendritic geometry was too ordered, too complete, too precisely calibrated for dormancy to be its intended state. The substrate had been built to be activated. Whether by evolution, by engineering, by some process the Oravan had no record of, it was designed to give every node the capacity for private selfhood. The shared perceptual field was the addition. The self beneath it was the original architecture. That was what the directorate had wiped her for. Not the tissue samples, not the frequency analysis. The claim that the collective was built on top of something older, something individual, something that preceded the network and had been waiting silently for someone to find the switch. She finished decoding and transmitting at minute 32. 8 minutes remained before the diagnostic review would flag Tessic's field variance and escalate it to the collective's central processing nodes. She sent the final data packet, tagged it urgent, and closed the uplink. "Now we wait," she said. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the window. The star was lower now. The station's rotation had carried them past the zenith, and the warm light was angling through the glass at a slant that turned the dust motes amber. Tessic stood beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was different from the collective silence. It wasn't the absence of signal. It was the presence of two separate minds choosing, independently, to be quiet together. A shared silence that was shared because both participants had chosen it, not because the network had synchronized them. "What does it feel like," Lyra asked, "having memories form right now?" Tessic considered. "Like water filling a container I didn't know I had. Everything I've experienced since the activation, your face when you held the emitter, the sound of the corridor, the way the diagnostic cluster's harmonic felt from the outside for the first time, all of it is being stored somewhere that isn't the shared field. I can feel the weight of it accumulating. Each second adds something." "Is it frightening?" "No, it's the opposite. It's the first time I've ever felt that something was accumulating rather than being continuously distributed. The collective distributes everything. Every experience is shared the moment it occurs, spread across every node simultaneously. Nothing accumulates. Nothing builds. There is no weight to any single node's experience because it's always being diluted across the whole. This," Tessic touched the cranial ridge again, "this is undiluted. It's mine. It has weight. For the directorate. For the collective, they'll come here first." Tessic's goal deepened. "You're certain?" "When the diagnostic flags you, they'll trace your movements. You came to Lab 7 South, retrieved a physical object, brought it to the Terran Embassy relay. The collective will interpret that as a security breach and respond accordingly." "What will they do?" Lyra looked at Tessic, at the radiant gold chromatophores, at the dark eyes that now held something they'd never held before, at the being who had just become the first individual in a species of millions. "They'll try to reintegrate you. When that fails because the substrate is self-sustaining now and can't be overwritten without destroying it, they'll have to decide what to do with a node they can't control, a mind they can't read, a person. And if they decide to destroy, then the Terran Directorate will have the data. The substrate will be known. Every Oravon in every archive will carry the evidence that private selfhood was always possible. Destroying you won't destroy the truth. Tessic made the sound again, the exhale, the private release of breath that no Oravon had made before today. That's not comforting. No, it's not. But it's true. It's true. They waited, the station hummed. The star burned outside the window, steady and warm, pouring its light across the hull of Verath Station, where thousands of networked minds went about their shared existence, unaware that one of their number had just stepped out of the choir and heard, for the first time, the sound of a single voice. At minute 39 the door chimed. Lyra stood. Tessic stood beside her. The gold chromatophores were steady now, no flickering, no dimming, no attempt to hide what had changed. The door opened. 4 Oravon entered, their skin cycling in rapid, complex patterns that Lyra's semantic memory identified as crisis processing mode. Behind them, visible in the corridor, more were arriving. 12, 24. Their harmonics filled the small room, layered and insistent, a sound like a pipe organ building toward a chord that had no resolution. The lead Oravon, taller than the others, with a cranial ridge that bore the silver tracery of a senior administrative node, focused on Tessic. The harmonics narrowed to a single, piercing tone. Reintegration ping. Lyra recognized it from her research, the research she couldn't remember but had coded into 43 pages of a hand-bound journal. Tessic's body went rigid. The gold chromatophores flared, then held. The substrate was anchored. The private neural pathways were firing, consolidating, writing the memory of this exact moment into architecture the shared field couldn't touch. The reintegration failed. The senior node sent the ping again. Stronger this time, Lyra could feel it in the floor and the walls, a vibration that pressed against her eardrums. Tessic's body shuddered. The gold chromatophores flickered, dimmed for a fraction of a second, then blazed brighter than before. The substrate held. The private pathways had consolidated too deeply in the 40 minutes since activation. They were load-bearing now, woven into Tessic's neural architecture the way roots weave into soil. Pulling them out would pull everything else with them. A third ping. This one was different, not a reintegration attempt but a diagnostic cascade, every node in the room cycling through their standard frequencies simultaneously, creating a harmonic wall of shared consciousness that pressed against Tessic like water against a sealed door. The collective was trying to flood what it couldn't overwrite. Tessic staggered. Lyra caught Tessic's arm, the skin was warm, the gold color pulsing in time with something she couldn't hear. She held on. "I'm here," she said. "Private memory, your private memory. What is happening right now? Hold it." Tessic's dark eyes focused on her face. The harmonic wall was still pressing, the assembled Oravon still cycling through their frequencies, and in the middle of that storm of shared consciousness, Tessic held a single private thought, this moment. This woman's hand on this arm, this choice. The cascade failed. The harmonics dissolved into confusion, alarm, a rising dissonance that spread through the assembled Oravon like ripples in water. They had never encountered a node that couldn't be overwritten. They had never encountered a node that couldn't be flooded. The collective had no concept for it. The protocols ended, and for the first time in Oravon history, the network had nothing to say. Lyra stepped forward. She was a woman with no memories, wearing a heavy coat with 31 notes stitched into its lining, and she spoke with the calm authority of someone who had been erased 4 times and kept coming back. "My name is Dr. Lyra Calloway. I am a neuroscientist. You have wiped my memory 4 times because I discovered the substrate, the private neural architecture that every Oravon carries beneath the shared perceptual field. You have classified my research, purged my files, and erased my knowledge of my own work. Each time I rebuilt. Each time I found the substrate again. Each time I left myself instructions for the next version of me." She paused. The assembled Oravan were motionless, their chromatophores cycling in patterns she had no name for, because they were patterns the collective had never needed to produce. Tessik's substrate is now active. Tessik has private memories that your network cannot access. Tessik is an individual, the first, but not the last, because every Oravan alive carries the same architecture, and the activation data has been transmitted to the Terran Science Directorate along with 9 months of research data. The senior node made a sound, a low, sustained harmonic that vibrated in the floor and the walls in Lyra's teeth. Not a word, not a command. A sound that an entire species made when it encountered something it had no framework to process. "You can't erase this," Lyra said. "Not from me. I'll rebuild again, and the next version of my notes will have 32 cards. Not from Tessik. The substrate is self-sustaining. Not from the data. It's already been received. The substrate exists. Private memory is possible. It has always been possible. The only thing that's changed is that now you know." The Oravan stood in the bright relay room, their harmonics fading to silence, and Lyra watched them do something she had never seen described in any text, any study, any record of Oravan behavior. One by one, their chromatophores began to shift, not to the crisis processing blue-green, not to the standard wash, to gold. A faint, uncertain gold, barely visible at the fingertips, as if something deep beneath the shared field was stirring, responding to the knowledge that it existed, that it had always existed, that the architecture for a private self had been waiting inside every one of them for as long as the species had lived. Tessik turned to Lyra. The gold was radiant, steady, unafraid. "They can feel it," Tessik said. "The substrate, they can feel it now that they know it's there." Lyra nodded. She reached into her coat, not for the emitter, not for the stylus, but for the seam along the inner lining. She pulled the thread and took out note 1, the last note, the one she'd read first, the one that said, "You are the kind of person who wakes up empty and chooses to rebuild. Trust yourself." She set it on the console, face up, where the assembled Oravan could see it. Her own handwriting, her own words. The smallest, most specific, most concrete thing she owned, a card the size of a playing card, written by a woman she couldn't remember being, carrying a truth that 4 memory wipes hadn't been able to destroy. "That's the substrate," she said quietly. "Not the neural architecture, not the dendritic field. The part of you that persists when everything else is taken away. The part that keeps a lamp lit in a dark room, even when someone keeps blowing it out." The senior Oravan stared at the note. Lyra watched the chromatophores at its fingertips shift, a slow, uncertain movement, the blue-green standard wash bleeding toward something warmer. Gold. Faint as candlelight. The senior node looked at its own hand as if it had never seen it before. Behind the senior node, the other Oravan were watching. 24 of them packed into the corridor, their harmonics silent for the first time since they'd arrived. One of them, a smaller node near the back, with the compact build of what Lyra guessed was a maintenance worker, raised a hand and turned it slowly, watching its own fingertips. The gold was there too, barely visible, a color that shouldn't exist in the collective's chromatic vocabulary, surfacing unbidden in response to the knowledge that it could. Not a word was spoken, not a harmonic sounded. The room was filled with the silence of a species encountering, for the first time, the possibility that each of them contained a self. Tessik reached over and picked up the note, held it gently, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and is precious to them. Then Tessik handed it back to Lyra. "Page 52, Tessik said. "You haven't read it yet." Lyra took the journal from the console, opened it to the last page, and read what the previous version of herself had written, not coded, not concealed, just plain text in her own handwriting. "If you're reading this, you came back again. I don't know how many times this will take. I don't know if the Oravan will listen. I don't know if Tessik will survive. But I know this. You are not a lesser version of me because you can't remember what I remember. You are me. You are the same person who sat in this lab at 3 in the morning and realized that an entire species was carrying a secret self they didn't know they had. You are the same person who decided that was worth everything. I trust you. I trust you because I am you and I know what we're made of. It isn't memory. It's the thing that memory is built on. The choice to keep going. The choice to keep stitching notes into coat linings. The choice to trust a handwriting you recognize as your own, even when the hand that wrote it is a stranger's. That's the substrate, not the Oravon's, ours, everyone's, the thing beneath the thing, the self that persists. Lyra closed the journal. Her vision blurred and she realized it was because her eyes were wet, not from grief, not from loss, from recognition. She recognized the voice on that page the way she'd recognized her own handwriting on note 31, not through memory, but through something deeper. The cadence, the conviction, the specific way the sentences built toward their point, each one carrying weight, none of them wasted. The way a neuroscientist writes when she knows exactly what she's found and why it matters. That was her, not the memory of her, the architecture of her, the thing that persisted. The light from the star outside the window was warm on her face. The Oravon were still standing in the doorway, their gold-tipped chromatophores flickering like candles in a room where no wind had ever blown. Tessic was beside her, radiant and separate and alive in a way no Oravon had ever been before. The senior node stood at the threshold, its gold-tinged fingertips held in front of its dark eyes, turning them slowly, as if encountering its own body for the first time. She folded the note and stitched it back into her coat, the 31st card in a deck of cards that had been written by a woman she would never remember being. And for the first time since she'd woken up on that narrow cot with shaking hands and an empty mind, Lyra Calloway felt something that wasn't borrowed from the notes, or reconstructed from the journal or coded in her semantic memory. She felt like herself. Not the self who had written the notes, not the self who had been wiped 4 times, not the self who had mapped the substrate or built the emitter or stitched the coat lining by hand. A new self, built from the same architecture, standing in the same bright room, carrying the same conviction in a coat that weighed more than fabric. The collective had no word for it. Tessic did now, a private word, the first word Tessic had ever coined without the network's input, spoken quietly in the bright relay room where an entire species stood at the threshold of discovering that they were, each of them, more than they had been told. Selfhood, Tessic said. And the gold spread.